Hello guys, this is Dave. Thank you so much for tuning in as always. Today I'm excited to bring you another long form type video. I had the chance to interview Mach33's CEO and founder, Aaron, as well as one of their analysts, Vlad, talking to them about their recently released valuation model that they worked on with ARK Invest to try and, model out how much they think SpaceX will be worth in the future. The numbers they landed on were quite bullish for SpaceX's value, especially from where it's valued right now, which is, still a lot more than Rocket Lab. So it's always felt a little bit odd to me being a space investor, not having any exposure at all to SpaceX, and I still don't, but I thought this was quite a timely interview given the latest news around tokenization of, potential equities for SpaceX, OpenAI, and others. There's a lot of controversy on that and how real it is, but I do think there's a lot of people out there following space companies that do have exposure to SpaceX, whether it's through, private stocks or various funds, the Barron Fund, ARK Space Fund, or even just Google Shares has some exposure to SpaceX. And I thought it'd be great to talk about what they're thinking SpaceX will be worth about in the future, if that has any implications for Rocket Lab, seeing as how Rocket Lab's trying to become the number 2, and if SpaceX is number 1, then surely Rocket Lab, will only benefit from being a number 2 as well. And Teddy is currently scratching at the door trying to get in, so sorry if you guys can hear him. Lots of good stuff here. I will link Mach33's website down below, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation. If you're new here and haven't already subscribed, please do consider hitting that subscribe button by the end of the video, because it helps out so much with the channel. And I'm also going to post this on my Spotify channel as well, which is something I'm starting to do with all the longer format videos, because I know it can be inconvenient using YouTube if you're, say, on the road driving, going for a run, working out, whatever, and you don't want to have to keep that window open if you don't have the paid version of YouTube and stuff like that. So there is a link to my Spotify as well down below. Okay, let's dive into my conversation around SpaceX and hope you guys enjoy. Aaron and Vlad from Mach33, thank you so much for joining the channel and talking to us about your SpaceX valuation.
Good to be
Thanks
here,
for having
Dave.
us.
Yeah, no problem. I think it's, more pertinent than ever, especially a lot of the chatter around Robinhood's announcement and tokenization, potentially getting access for retail investors to invest in, private companies. So very good timing on this one, I think.
Totally agree. We've really been talking about that a lot, actually, in the last couple of days.
Okay, great. So first of all, for those who aren't aware, can you maybe just tell us a little bit about yourselves and Mach33 and what you guys do?
Yeah, so I'm Aaron Burnett, founder and CEO of Mach33. We are a research-led asset manager, so we really like to dive deep into things. We do focus on frontier technologies. Space is a, pardon the pun, but a fairly strong center of gravity for us. And our research really fixates and focuses on things that kind of we find interesting and maybe don't understand, and then have an opportunity to potentially back that up with investment. We do tend to focus on the private markets, with our investments. It's really all of our investments are private markets. And so, we do tend to focus there, but, obviously there's some impact on the public markets occasionally. And so the SpaceX in the model and investments associated with that is a big piece of investing in space. If you don't have a piece of SpaceX or try to have some exposure there, then you maybe not able to call yourself that much of a space investor. So that's me. I'll let Vlad take it from here.
Yeah, so Aaron briefed us on Mach33. I'm head of research at Mach33, so yeah, I'm in the details on all the modeling that we do, especially this last model we put out on SpaceX. That's been my baby for about a year. So all things research eventually find their way to me. Finance background otherwise.
We really appreciate you guys, sharing it for everyone. And I'll put a link in the description down below. A very thorough model. The spreadsheets are there, as well as the high level report people can go over. And I think it's fascinating and a great resource. We'll dive into SpaceX valuation soon. I just figured I'd ask, high level, zooming all the way out. Why space in terms of like where a lot of the focus is for you guys?
Maybe easy answer. We're just geeks and interested in that. I know for me, like it really started back in the, when I saw the Falcon Heavy taking off in 2018. And the landing, really, that landing of the booster side by side was like quintessential science fiction movie that I was watching. How could that be real? And so ever since that point, I've been really trying to fixate on how to make that go faster in any way I can. How do I accelerate human expansion into space? That's kind of the genesis for why I focus on space. And then it's just interesting. It's like the most interesting technologies, the most interesting markets. A lot of the markets are new and evolving. You're trying to understand what the opportunities are to make money. I think ultimately one of the most exciting uses of time that you can have as an investor.
Yeah, and if I could add something there, so I think we're also the timing is right. So I was also always a space geek, and I was working in finance, focusing obviously terrestrially on Earth companies. And then I was also looking at what SpaceX were doing, and I was thinking, you know what my dream job would be? It would be to do what I'm doing now in finance, but to do it for space. And the more the commercial side of space was accelerating, I realized that that is actually happening now, and it's not something that I've got to wait a decade or two to happen, because space was the frontier of exploration in the last couple of decades, but now it's an economic frontier. And we fundamentally believe that, in the same way humanity has expanded across the globe, eventually that will spill over into space, and it's starting to happen now. We're just seeing the early innings of that. So there's economic opportunity there, and we're just finally reaching a cross section where the costs of access to space are coming down so much, the use cases and the revenue opportunities are starting to emerge. So right place, right time.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I'm a huge fan of space, obviously, and one day I figured, you know what, invest in what you know, and I feel like us being fans actually gives us a bit of a leg up on that. So, are you able to share with us what your big investments in the space industry are? I assume SpaceX is up there. Do you have any others you're able to tell us about?
Yeah, on the asset manager side, these are on our website. We've done have interest in SpaceX as well as Stoke Space, and we like them for a variety of different reasons. And then also we have a pretty big interest in kind of the humanoid robotics and what it does for accelerating human expansion into space. I do think Optimus and Tesla and those guys will be doing really important work. They may be the first things outside of the robots that are already there today. They may be the first robots, humanoid robots there on Mars. But I do think humanoid robots and robotics in general is a very important piece. So we're also invested in Aptronic as well. So kind of some of our bigger positions. And then we have a series of early stage investments that are really interesting, and no one will know them if I say the name today, but in a few years you guys may recognize them once they kind of hit their stride.
But those are more, just so you know, those are Earth observation right now, a couple of them, and other propulsion. So outside of launch, propulsion is another key area. Obviously, as an investor, you need to have return money and you return profit over a 5-year investment horizon. And so while we're in it for the long game, we're going to be doing this for decades. Right now, we're invested in the companies that we think are going to grow the most in the next 5 years, and those are propulsion, those are Earth observation for now.
Yeah, I'd agree. Stoke is very interesting with what they're doing as well. Okay, so I think I'll go ahead and ask you, Vlad, to share, if you can, the model, and you'll take us through some high-level info that I'm sure people will be interested in for the SpaceX valuation.
Yeah, so I'll try and hit all the most interesting and important points. So the first thing to know is that this model is a Monte Carlo model. So what does that mean? That means that we created an accounting and a financial framework for where all the cash goes in SpaceX's business. And as we were doing that, we identified a couple dozen variables that we're unsure about. So, things like when does Starship become reusable? When does it become commercially viable? How much of Starship launches are going to be dedicated to Starlink versus commercial? And what you do is in that model, you plug those unknowns in and you say, well, if I had to guess, this is where I think it would land in a range. And the Monte Carlo model takes all of those different variables and the uncertainty, and it runs thousands of simulations. And it says, well, if I had to randomly pick between the ranges that you picked for these variables, then this is the output in terms of valuation, in terms of cash flow. And so the first graph I wanted to show you here. Am I getting a live feed? Am I on the right? Oh, here we go. So this distribution here is basically the likelihood of the value of SpaceX in 2030. So you see it's very tight, and it lands somewhere around 2 trillion, 2.5 trillion. And then when we project things towards Mars, you get a different distribution model. You get this red curve that includes Earth and Mars. So that's the 2040 curve, while the blue one is the 2030 curve. And just wanted to hit this here, but basically we have a lot more certainty. So the tightness of this blue curve means we have a lot more certainty about 2030 and the value of SpaceX, while the red curve being wider means that there is more uncertainty about what the outcome will be. We know it'll be higher, but where it will land, we don't know. Likelihood for 2040, based on how we've modeled it, is somewhere around 12 trillion. So this is basically the output of the model and the values and the chances of those values occurring. So the model, is based on a bunch of things, but the most important driver for Starlink's value, especially through 2030, is Starlink. So Starlink not only will make a lot more money for SpaceX than the launch business, but it's much more profitable. And the reason is that those satellites, when they're up there for 5 years at a time, they're constantly generating revenue over 5 years. So 24/7. And each time they add another one, they just keep adding another one, and it basically compounds. So this curve here is effectively where the bandwidth is in space today. So Starlink is already successful, and we expect them to hit almost 700 terabits per second in terms of bandwidth this year. But if you look at this curve, we're very much at the beginning. So by 2030, once Starship is going and they have the next generation satellites up, that's going to be almost at 20,000 terabits. So that's like basically a 30x.
It is a lot. Sorry to jump in. Do you guys divide that between like direct to device cell and kind of the more traditional broadband, or is that all in there?
So so this one here, this model, it basically made, so one thing that I want to get across is with modeling in general, the more complexity you add, sometimes it's not necessarily helpful. And so one assumption we made based on a couple of things, one, that Starlink right now is prioritizing broadband. So having a dish on your house and getting satellite internet from space, that is their priority. That being said, they're obviously also getting into direct to cell, which is when you have satellite internet going to your phone. But for the basis of this model, we just assumed that SpaceX will allocate the right amount of bandwidth, or the right amount of satellites is more precise, to either broadband or direct to cell. So this model, looking more at SpaceX's long-term picture, didn't really focus that much on direct to cell. That being said, we are focusing pretty heavily now on our research on direct to cell, because we think there's a lot of unknowns there, especially from an investing standpoint, on what the addressable market is. I think that's the biggest question, really. What will direct to cell be capable of, and what is the addressable market? So this here is purely broadband, let's just say, for simplicity's sake. But we're very much aware of direct to cell, and we'll be putting out some work on that this year.
Well, I consider that very bullish then, if there's potential for more direct to cell in there as well, or in the future.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
and I would let me just kind of interject a little bit, because I think it's important. We did this in collaboration with ARK Invest, and one of they were really encouraging us, and I think really helpful in the idea of like simplifying, because you can, we're very bottoms up people. We love doing that, but like there is this like idea of like what kind of umbrella catches most of these potential Monte Carlo simulation outcomes, and that's really what one of the things they did, and they have a really good TAM analysis that kind of says here's the cost per megabit per second people are paying today, and here's how that evolves over time, and here's the global kind of market for that can technically come from a variety of different sources, whether that's direct to sell or anything like that. But functionally, I think that's been it was very helpful in kind of capturing pretty much all the opportunities for where the revenue is coming from. Either way, any way you kind of sliced it, whether it's Starshield, Starlink, broadband, potential for direct to sell, a lot of those things, depending on what simulation variable came in at what time and over what dates and all these potential permutations, it kind of came out to these numbers on a base case, like showing where the most of that's probably coming from consumer broadband. There's going to be some potential D2C. There's going to be some potential Starshield as well. And what does that look like in any given, scenario?
Okay.
Do you want me to? I'm going to continue running through these charts because there's only two more, and I think it's worth it. Just
Sure.
quickly.
Yeah. Let's go ahead.
This is basically the accounting breakdown of how Starlink is going to make money through 2030. As you can see, very similar curve to the capacity increase. Not a surprise, but where it gets interesting is obviously Elon has stated publicly that his goal is to go to Mars, and one of the biggest goals of this model was to be the first, because no one's actually done it, but to put some sort of economic value on what it means to go to Mars. So out of all the money they make from Starlink, we then plug that into how many starships can they send to Mars, and how in our case we used Optimus Robots as an estimate, a proxy for productivity. So we could have done humans and X amount of cargo. Instead, it was Optimus Robots and X amount of cargo, just for the sake of simplicity. This curve here basically shows how the cost of going to Mars is going to reduce over time based on the model. So if they were to go to Mars today, which they can't because there's no transfer window right now, but it costs about 13 grand per kilogram. And as Starship becomes more reusable and there's more starships, that comes down. Eventually by 2040, the cost of going to Mars will be $500 a kilogram.
Wow.
And another thing is, how many starships are going to be sending a year? So right now it's 0, of course. They aim to send a few later in 26, but our model says they'll send 0 because it was conservative. But basically this number goes up, and this is cash from Starlink. So we calculated if they diverted this amount of money from Starlink to Mars, how many starships could they send? As you can see, that accelerates, it compounds over time. So from 2030, maybe they'll send 20 starships to Mars. By 2040, they can afford to send 2,000 starships to Mars. And so that still isn't anywhere near close to how many planes or ships are in movement every day. So while 2,000 rockets seems like a lot, we firmly believe that this is very within the realm of possibility, and in fact likely to happen. And then the last.
Another quick question. Sorry.
Yeah. Please.
Those are starships going to Mars, not like refueling launches as well, right?
Correct.
So
Correct.
for each
so
one of those,
2,000, you need 4 to 6, depending on how big Starship is, to refuel.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a good question. This is not Starship launches overall, but literally the amount of starships that are heading to Mars a year.
Okay.
And then last and final chart that evolves to is the balance sheet buildup. So what is the value that is being built up on Mars from all of these starships going over there? So like I said, you can try and model all the intricacies of, maybe we'll send 20% humans, 80% robots. Maybe we'll send mainly humans. Maybe, we'll give them rovers or drones, or you can really dig into the details. But one thing that ARC were very great at, as Aaron alluded to, is they're very good at thinking first principles and simplifying things where they need to be simplified. And so the Monte Carlo part of the model takes into account the uncertainty. And instead of, and it handles the uncertainty. So we can put the uncertainties aside. And instead we have one unit of productivity, which in this case was an Optimus robot. And so if they're sending that many Starships, how many Optimus robots can they send? Well, in 2030, given it was what, 25 Starship launches, they'll have 1,000 roughly Optimus robots on Mars after those launches. By the time you get to 2040, you could have up to 1 million Optimus robots on Mars. So that's the red curve. And then the green curve is basically a sum, a total of the productivity of each one of those units or each one of those Optimus robots. So if we basically assumed that each robot is capable of producing enough stuff or enough productivity as a US construction worker with some variability according to the Monte Carlo. And if you make that assumption, this is how much value that many Optimus robots can generate on Mars by 2040. So we're saying it'll account for 3.5 billion of value of which, and that, you know, that could take the form of anything. It could be holes dug in the ground. It could be shelters. It could be, you know, all kinds of energy, power, putting those things together. So it was very much a job of averages, but that's how modeling is. You have to simplify things in order to get insights. So I think that's high level what the model was about. I encourage anyone to read this in more detail if they're interested.
Thanks. Yeah, I do appreciate how you guys simplify it down. Like, you know, Starlink, we've got all these different satellite models and launch and everything like that, but we're just looking at bandwidth and the Optimus robots. Has SpaceX said for sure they're planning to send Optimus as kind of their first workers?
Yeah, that's been theorized by and stated by Elon and others. Yeah, is that the only thing they send? Is it, you know, do they send other things? Sure, but like that's been pretty well kind of stated that that's likely going to be the case. I mean, there's a non-zero chance that Optimus doesn't work somehow or they're unable to get it to work, but I'd be very surprised if they don't ever send an Optimus.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense.
He said he would send them next year, right? Like that was the goal. Which right now you know, the chances might be slimming given the rate of progress of Starship. But his goal was to send them as soon as next year. So even that, if that was more maybe to make a statement to show that it's possible, and it might be a very early edition of Optimus that isn't as capable as the ones that will be in 2040. But 100%. He's stated the goal of sending Optimus to Mars, and they're very well suited to it. I think sending a human to somewhere where it's hard for them to survive is risky, and having humanoid robots set the groundwork is obviously ideal.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I'm sure, you know, we all want to see humans there eventually, but
and we will.
Yeah, definitely the way to go. What kind of inputs into the Mars model were kind of having the biggest impact on the value there? Is it the price of an Optimus? Is it getting launched down cheap? Like when they get full reusability going? What's the biggest factors?
So you hit a lot of those there. So I think the most important, it's hard for me to, we could actually run a statistical analysis and figure that out. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I can tell you which one is, I can't tell you the order, but I can tell you the most important ones. So there's the cost of Optimus, the productivity of Optimus. So how productive are they compared to a human? If you gave Optimus a shovel or a human a shovel, which one would create more output? The third one is how much cargo we need to send. So per humanoid, whether that's an Optimus robot or literally a human, how much cargo do you need to send with them for them to do their job and create the productivity that you've assumed? So tools, energy, you know, shelter, and tools was actually a big bracket because that's a lot of what it'll be, but what those tools are. And so that uncertainty was represented in the Monte Carlo as a range. So we said, okay, well, they'll at least need, and this is off the top of my head, but they'll at least need as much mass of tools as massive Optimus, or maybe they'll need 5 times the amount of tools as massive Optimus. And so then the next lever that's super important is what is the cost of those tools? So what are we sending? Are we really sending them with shovels, or are we sending them with nuclear reactors and with drills and with radiation shielded shelters, and and so we encapsulated that in the range of uncertainties in the model, such that the random simulations that happened distributed all the potential outcomes, even though we don't know actually what they're going to send. So that's the beauty of the Monte Carlo, is that we can plug in our uncertainty and it will give us a range of possible outcomes.
Sure. Yeah, I have to admit, so I'm completely with you guys on the 2030 valuation with Starlink and the revenue. I struggle more with Mars. I think, obviously, no one's paying them for a lot of this. So I guess you're just coming down to like the value of the assets on the planet.
So I love this question because this is
Yeah.
one of the main questions that we get. And so one thing that you've got to think about is that Mars is a planet of untapped real estate and resources. So it's actually pretty resource rich, much more resource rich than the moon. We would never be able to live on the moon, really. Moon could be an outpost, but you could never live on the moon. Mars has enough resources in order to build an economic base. And so when you send, whether it's humans or Optimus robots, to start building that base on Mars, our initial reaction is to try and value that based on what are they producing that we can sell now.
Exactly.
Or
Yeah.
It's like, what, people are expecting that in 2040. I don't think there's no way. I don't think in 2040 the goods will be produced on Mars that are sold on Earth. That's not going to happen yet. That will happen eventually, in my opinion, but not by 2040. That being said, every time you set up an outpost on Mars that is self-sustaining and has the ability to harness the resources around, which are effectively free because no one else can claim them. Once you set up a base that can do that, the value of the asset increases because of the future optionality. So because of the potential of what that can do in the future. So this is an analogy I keep bringing up that I'm still not certain is a good one. But say you've got your house and you take some money and you decide to dig a hole in your backyard and build a pool. The value of your house goes up, even though you've lost a bunch of money. And no one's coming to your house and no one's taking your cash and you haven't sold anything, but the value of your house has gone up because you have a pool. And so we're kind of using that same line of reasoning with Mars, that in the very early stages, even though they're not producing goods that are being commercially sold on a terrestrial market, it's really the early innings of a Mars economy that will eventually be trading within itself, and then eventually maybe shipping goods back to Earth, maybe in the decades following 2040.
Yeah. I heard you.
I'm gonna add a bit of
ahead.
a kind of a thing here that's very important to this whole concept. You have to, if you're thinking about Mars, any kind of value of Mars, you do have to get over the assumption, and it is an assumption, but get over the assumption that Elon is going to go to Mars in some meaningful way. Like he stated it, it's his goal. He's got billions of free cash flow at his disposal over the next 5 years. Is then the reasonable human being you should be asking yourself, will he make that happen? Yes or no? When I say that, I mean landing on Mars in any kind of meaningful way, not just gimmicky one successful flight over 10 years. No, it's like large amounts of mass to Mars. If that's the case, then a lot of this starts to take shape. Then the backup or the follow-up to that's an assumption that I think most people don't, especially investors, don't really take for granted or aren't willing to really underwrite, is the idea that there are millions of people today, I would say at least 1 million today on Earth, that if that was an option, that being going to Mars to set up, home base or whatever, without dying in some kind of reasonably economical, accessible way, then they would do it. Those people exist. I run in those circles very deeply. So I know them. We talk about this. Like they don't want to go to die. They're not going because but that is a human drive. And so if you can accept those two things, meaning they can get there because Elon's going to make it happen, and that there is a demand for it to go, there is an economy there. Like whether you like it or not, 1 million people or 100,000 or whatever, there's a micro or small kind of economy, and there's demand for resources within that economy. And there's plenty of historical precedents here. You have your Dutch East Indies companies and things like that that were able to do this. They didn't just go because they had no concern for the economy that was there. They did want to bring back beaver pelts or other resources. But if you were to, there are some people that want to claim that that was the only reason they went. That's clearly not the only reason they went. Those were maybe core reasons or what have you. But those companies today, the asset value of the land that they may have owned or whatever, it basically turned into governments. And so like you're talking trillions and trillions of dollars. So this was underscore, like it was a very important piece as to why we even did this. Because you may kind of look, risk looking dumb saying like there's some economic value to Mars. And this was kind of our reason for doing this. And it was something I pushed pretty hard. Like we have to showcase what would happen if Elon does what he says to any level of success, and there are people going there, because then you have a whole economy that most people are willing to hand wave away as an actual zero, and that's not reasonable either, right? This is not a zero economic output. If these two things happen, there is going to be value created. Now you can argue like what percentage of value and how much value do they create, and is it just value for a small portion of people, which means there's a small pool of buyers, which means there's low liquidity, which means the value is probably lower. All those things. These are arguments to be made, but to date, the massive hand wave argument is there is zero value, economic value to Mars. That's been the massive hand wave argument, and I think that's wrong. And so this is a first step in that direction. And say we can be wrong. I think we're more directionally right than wrong, but at least.
Can I have one more example? I'm really sorry, Dave. One more thing.
Oh, go ahead.
I think this is also another analogy. I think the East Indian Company is a good one. But why did people move to America, North America, as it is today, from Europe initially? It's not like, you were living in Europe maybe, and you had your very nicely built house, and you could walk down the road, and you could buy freshly made bread, and life was super comfy and cozy. But then there were certain people who said, you know what, I want something new, and I want to create generational wealth. And I could go to America, and I'll take a, however many weeks ship ride, go to America, claim this piece of land. And those people ended up creating generational wealth for their families. They ended up owning acres and acres of land that at first could not be tapped because the tools and the infrastructure were not there and the economic base was not there. But that built up over time. And us humans, we find it hard to think beyond a 5-year investment horizon, or maybe even beyond 1 year. It's very hard. Even one day the markets go down, everyone's freaking out, right? But if you step back and you look at the big picture of how humanity has evolved, we see Mars akin to the same way humanity has expanded anywhere around the globe.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense to me. And Aaron, I agree with your initial data points there that I think, some people still don't believe Elon is serious about going. And I think he's 100% dead serious about it. And probably we'll get there eventually. And yes, there's definitely people out there to be interested to go. I suppose I struggle on the time aspect and how long it will take for that value to be realized. I know we kind of talked about the pool, but with the house, it takes a while for there to be a market for that pool, right? So, if you build something on Mars for the next 10 years, no one else is really able to buy that from you. So I struggle with that one a little bit over the shorter term. So yeah, definitely challenging though. I would have a ton of trouble building out a model like this.
It's to be fair, it is, we make it pretty clear in the model. It's book value, which is written to a balance sheet, so it's not realized as in there's like a GDP number and transacted. So there's definitely some wiggle room there as to what the actual value of Mars is. I think we had 3 trillion was the base case during the 2040 time horizon. That's the thing though. Like, how do you, if you were trying to forecast the new world or even the West Coast back, that's a little bit easier. Sometimes it's a little bit, more focused. I think to Vlad's point, freedom is a driver for human beings. Like there's going to be some kind of freedom associated with Mars, whether that's political or ideological or some kind of taxation. I mean, there's always going to be some kind of freedom there. And I think one of the things that is, if you look at patterns that repeat through history, these places where freedom goers or high agency people are attracted to, people that want to make something of themselves and are reliant on themselves mainly, and aren't reliant on other external support structures. If you have filters for that, there tends to be at least in the data point of two with the US and then the West Coast, that's where a lot of value gets accrued over time. I think Mars may be the single biggest filtering mechanism for high agency people over the next 100 years. So it makes total sense to me that you're going to see one of the most ambitious economies, one of the most ambitious, maybe the most free as far as regulatory limitations and scrutiny on energy production or what have you. It makes sense that Mars leads our little solar system in cost of energy over that time and things like that. Even with all the things against them, there's been a bit of a history and a pattern for that. So point being, the model itself will just give you a book value. That's what it's designed to do.
Right. Yeah, and there's some other points for it in there that I thought were very interesting. I didn't really think about, but yeah, it's a lot easier to escape Mars's gravity than the Earth. So as we look further into the future, that makes a lot more sense to use that as a jumping off point. And as a space fan, I certainly hope it happens in the long-term future. Do you ever worry as an investor that perhaps Elon will do it even if there was other opportunities that would make more financial sense because he's so focused on making life interplanetary?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to underwrite that if you're thinking about that investment from compared to something else. And he's already doing it. I mean, if you look at the way Starship has been evolved today and the program, it goes back to, do you think Elon will do it? If you don't think Elon will do it, then just look at the choices they've made on Starship. They have been worried about re-entry and the heat tiles and all that other stuff. And the main reason you're doing that is you're pushing for being able to go to Mars long term. If you were just trying to get maximum dollar value, then you would be trying to get V3 up as soon as possible, and you'd be maybe expending your upper Starship sooner rather than later, or for the first few launches, and just proving out and getting V3s up there.
Right.
So I think the choices they're making are pretty indicative of that. And there's going to be billions invested. I forget what the number was for billions into Starbase itself. There's a certain percentage of that might go to, you could say, be underwritten by Starlink, but there's a decent percentage of that is effectively underwritten by the Mars ambition. So I think if you're not invested in that long term, you're not thinking about what the upside is long term for Mars, then you're underwriting a less than perfectly efficient use of your capital towards, let's just say, just Starlink or other use cases. But I think if you're investing in Elon, then you look at someone who kind of over clubs for a very ambitious, very hard problem and builds these crazy things for this very hard problem. And there's all these knock-on effects. V3 wasn't necessarily the reason Starship was born. It really, I mean, if you think about it, really wasn't. At least maybe they were planning it in the back of their head the whole time, but now all of a sudden they have this huge volume with huge mass capabilities where they can pack a lot more power and get a lot more bandwidth, an order of magnitude or 20x increase in bandwidth in the same kind of, for the same kind of cost. And so does that exist without a push for Mars? You could argue it doesn't. Would they have landed on a Starship type of vehicle to get, just to get to, if they needed some next iteration of a satellite? More than likely would look a lot different. And so that's the way I look at it in underwriting. If you need an analogy, maybe look at what Apple has done. If someone comes in, Elon, unfortunately, something happens to him and he no longer can run SpaceX, there's going to be a Tim Cook style of figure that takes SpaceX and probably just is incentivized to drive more revenue towards the Starlink and higher margins. That was probably likely to go public sooner because of the whole return to investors requirement. But then you may have this thing where you make a lot of money for a decade, and then you're sitting on your ninth version of a Starlink satellite, as opposed to what's the next big thing. I think that's kind of what the way you look at this. If you're an investor and underwriting the Elon risk factor.
Yeah, I think that's a great argument. Without Elon, maybe it looks like an Apple with the future, all these iPhones pumping out, but it no longer really excites me so much.
One of my things that when I was a younger investor, I've been investing since I was 12, weirdly enough. But in 2011, 2012, I was very clearly have an argument with a friend that Apple's can't go anywhere now because of Steve Jobs. Vision is gone. I was at I forget the reason we were having that argument, but we were having that argument. I was incredibly wrong. I think I was right, but I was incredibly wrong about the time horizon.
Yeah.
I thought that would impact this in a few years, not 10 or beyond. And so that's I think there is a place in time for returning investment dollars to and just optimizing a business itself with the business model that it has. And you can make a lot of money that way. But there's some time horizon innovation, and that vision kind of push is required. And I don't know if that's in 5 years, in 10 years, or 20, but somewhere in that time frame, more than likely.
Maybe a little bit of an awkward question, but do you worry at all being invested with the Elon company nowadays? There's a lot of stories about, I don't know, like drug use and just controversial and maybe seeming less stable. Is that just something you accept, kind of like, I guess Steve Jobs back in the day, or any of these other visionary guys, or does it worry you at all?
Not really. I mean, I think there's all sorts of people that will try and create problems and create some negative headline. I think in most cases this stuff is pulled out of context, and when you invest in a founder at very early stages. This is much later stage. You're investing. People that are investing in SpaceX are investing more in the business. They can see this now. Yeah. But at very early stages, you see people that invested in Elon early have been very, very richly rewarded. There are billionaires printed with primarily that net worth being off of Elon's ability to create and create a vision that's crazy and then execute on that vision. No human's perfect. You kind of take your good with the bad. So if you're an investor, I don't know, it's a pretty great track record. Yeah. Regardless of all of the pros and cons. Anything, you can be wrong. It could be wrong. There could be some crazy thing in the future, but I think your pros far outweigh your cons here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the proof is in the pudding. If you look at how far as companies are ahead of the competition, especially if we're talking SpaceX.
Yeah.
I mean, SpaceX is the space industry right now. They launched 90% of all mass globally. No one else has a partially reusable rocket, even though they've been trying for years, and no one is really going to have a partially reusable rocket anytime soon at the scale that SpaceX has now. If he's doing ketamine on the weekend, I could not care less when I look at those Falcon 9s land perfectly. If I start seeing that, he's making bad operational decisions and the business is falling apart and there's more failures all of a sudden because of Elon decisions, then I would start to get worried. But personally, I'm not either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you're talking to a big fan of Rocket Lab, an investor there, but certainly don't disagree with the execution on the SpaceX side of things. And if it had been public earlier, I probably would have been an investor as well. I did want to ask you guys, because there has been talk about spinning out and IPOing Starlink. Have you thought much about, if that were to happen, which asset you'd prefer to hold, the SpaceX or the public Starlink shares, or the difference there?
The Starlink IPO or SpaceX IPO, whatever the combination of this kind of large liquidity event thing is heavily debated. No one really knows. There's been indications that it'll happen by Elon and others. He's making a lot of cash flow now, so he has no real reason to take a big chunk of equity off the table. There's pros and cons to it. I think Brett at ARK said this on a previous podcasts, so I can repeat it, which is there's probably incentives for them long term. If you are really big and public and an important piece of a backbone, maybe a monopoly, there's probably some incentive for you to be public at that point, because you kind of have a political purse shield to some extent, where they can't just go like, DoD can't just absorb you or something, or nationalize you just because you are a monopoly. It's like, you have millions of potential shareholders that get angry, and that's like a political thing. So there's potential for that, I think, long term. But it's really hard to know. If I were to hold, the thing is with Starlink, it would really depend, like who's running that. Is there a lot of growth opportunities? I'm a early guy, kind of growth looking sort of individual. I'm happy to have long time horizons to capture multiple alpha. And so with that in mind, like if I'm looking and holding that, let's say 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years from now, where our model is exactly correct, 90% of roughly 90% of SpaceX value gets spun out into what's effectively a public market company called Starlink. I would look for the contrarian bet and say, if they are well positioned for Mars, and I can place a 20-year bet on a company that's going to be the only way to get to Mars, and it's a bet on an entire planet, then I'm looking at that bet and thinking, okay, maybe SpaceX is only worth, SpaceX as itself is only worth 200 billion, and it could be worth 20 trillion, right? Like these are really big multiples. And if you look at when the investors backed Elon's SpaceX back in the 2000s, like pre-2000 teens, like they were rewarded for holding these things for like 20 years. So that's where, obviously, do you put your entire net worth there, have no liquidity or something? No, but like, I think that's the way I would go if it was me. I don't know, Vlad, what do you think?
It's a very interesting bet. Wow.
I think that, you'd probably hold a bit of both. But if I was, if Starlink was public, I think it'd still have a lot of growth to go from 2030 to 2040. And telecoms is a massive industry. The margins are huge for Starlink. Launch is a hard business. SpaceX, until they're really generating value on Mars, SpaceX would just be launching rockets, and launching rockets is expensive, and the profit margins are small because it's hardware. It's like, fuel is expensive. While satellites, these satellites could be putting out 80% profit margins perpetually for 5 years. It's a much more profitable business. So, early 2030, say it spins out, I think I would hold mainly Starlink, and then as Starlink growth starts to taper, I would slowly move towards SpaceX because of the Mars vision, which I also believe in along with that.
Here's an argument to counter that a little bit. If that does separate, Starlink is absolutely beholden to one launcher for their
That's
vehicle.
what I was worried about. I'm like, how do you own Starlink and have it like 100% reliant on the now, separate SpaceX? Well, separate, but I'm sure there'll still be some ownership. But
that's where I get some of these little details, like they're called seem little, but like they could be relatively important and part of the whole idea of like, how does a spin out actually work, right? Like, do they even need it? The whole idea of, you mentioned Robinhood with the tokenization thing, which is, the announcement sounded a lot nicer than the reality of the situation if you look into the SEC regulations and stuff. But I do believe that kind of thing is the future for private company ownership. Is that 2 years or 5 years? I don't know. Maybe it's in that time frame. Maybe it's beyond that time frame. If that exists, though, they may never need to go public, because there may be large liquidity pools of retail investors if the SEC and all those guys get their act together, that would support like a private forever type of company. And then there's all sorts of other regulatory issues that potentially
does it count as private
hinder
at that
something
point?
like that.
That's what I'm getting confused in. Like, what? Is it still a private company? And then
probably be like, it would probably
reporting.
say 70% of it is private. Oh, SpaceX, they're 80% private, 20% public, because 20% of the float is tokenized on whatever, Robinhood. So, we'll probably get to a point where there'll be hybrid companies at some point soon.
Yeah.
This is all future. Like, we're talking about definitions, things that people that have like defined the what is a public, what is a private, and it's like layers and layers of regulatory nuance. And so like quite frankly, there are a ton of holders of SpaceX in some direct or indirect way. And this is when you start to get like they need to redefine public and private if this were to be happening, like effectively.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like that's where I think this gets a little bit tricky. It's more interesting for European holders as of now, because in theory, if they can figure out the supply side, companies would have to, a private company would have to be bought in if you were going to have like a float of that many shares publicly with retail investors, even if it's private retail investors. And so let's assume they get all that stuff. You know, maybe it's only a European or non-US thing for a few years. I don't know. But point being, you know, there are financial let's put financial innovations, fintech innovations, crypto and whatnot, that might just change this whole paradigm for what we think of going public or liquidity of it all.
Yeah. Well, it's a extremely thorough valuation, and definitely any viewers out there who are interested in SpaceX, I highly recommend you dive into the spreadsheet as well, and not just the site. Although the site is great with those graphs, so thank you guys for sharing it. I guess just a couple last questions. Do you have any worries about competition there, whether it's Stoke coming for Rocket Lab or no, Stoke coming for SpaceX, or Kuiper, or AST even for direct to sell? Is that going to reduce margins at all in the long term?
Can we take that one, Aaron?
I'll let you take the AST side, then I'll knock it down.
Okay, well, you mentioned a couple of those things. So I think, first of all, I think for the next 5 years, so reasonably in a reasonable investment horizon on the launch side, I think anyone who is coming into launch now is going to have to fight for the scraps that SpaceX are creating. So, you know, getting a reusable rocket is hard enough. Getting a reusable rocket to launch 170 times a year is even harder, and that's going to take a long time. So I'm really looking forward to Rocket Lab and Stoke getting their vehicles going. That being said, I think they will have to be fighting for what SpaceX leaves, and luckily SpaceX prioritizes itself. So 70% of SpaceX launches are for Starlink, and there's a whole space economy that's growing right now and just getting started. So it's not that they won't have revenue and they won't have the opportunity. They just won't be able to compete on price until 2030, at least in my opinion, especially with Starship going commercial in that horizon. And so they'll have to compete in other ways. So what offering can they provide that SpaceX can't? Because they won't compete on cost. So they'll have to compete on other things like flexibility. If I want to, fix a satellite in my constellation, can you get my satellite up next week? Because SpaceX is backed up on the log for 6 months. Or maybe, I have a dedicated launch. I want to go to a specific orbit that SpaceX doesn't provide, because in the few commercial launches that SpaceX does, they drop them in a very general orbit. Maybe I need to go to a specific orbit for a certain type of satellite or a certain type of bit of space infrastructure that I'm building, and then I'll rely on a Rocket Lab or a Stoke. So I think it's going to be really interesting how the launch side shakes out over the next couple of years. We'll have to see how SpaceX handles Falcon 9, whether they keep launching Falcon 9 once Starship is up and going, and at what rate they stop launching Falcon 9, because they've clearly stated they will stop launching Falcon 9.
Yeah.
So
sorry to interject. What do you have in there for your models going forward in terms of like Falcon 9 launches? Does that start tapering? Like, where's the hump on that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of variables to take into account here. First of all, is Starship, when it originally begins launching, is, in our opinion, going to be focused solely on Starlink. And the reason is that they can get a much higher dollar return on spending those Starship launches on launching the next generation satellites. So they'll make more money doing that, and so that's what they'll focus on. Now we expect at the beginning, maybe it'll be 100% Starlink for the first year. They won't launch any commercial payloads. And so Falcon 9 will still be running at that point because there's commercial demand. maybe by 2030 that will go down to 70%, which is what it is now for Falcon 9. And then at that point, there won't really be a need for Falcon 9 as much, because Starship is handling all the commercial demand that they can. So the model purposefully leaves that as an unknown, so it's a variable. At what point do they phase Falcon 9 out versus keeping it in? And all we know is that by about 2030, we think Falcon 9 won't be launching anymore, but it could be a lot earlier. So it purely depends on the pace of Starship becoming reusable and commercially reusable.
Sure.
But you also mentioned AST Space Mobile.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting one.
Before we get there, I wanted to give a little bit of my take on the Vlad said some things that I think, like, one of the bets that we've made is Stoke, and one of the things that goes a little slightly, a bit of a twist on what he was saying was, can you get cost per kilogram down to something that's competitive with Falcon 9? That may not happen for 5 years, right? The core thing that I think Stoke does that is different is they bought into fully reusable from day one, and it's rapidly fully reusable with things like the full metal heat shields and all that. Now, this needs to be proven, right? There's definitely a technical risk component to this. If they are leading, if they get anywhere close to the historical cadence for execution, right? They're the third company ever. Someone might need to correct me. Third company ever to do a full flow stage combustion engine.
They're the second, actually, after SpaceX commercially, and then before that was the
third
US
ever historical full flow stage combustion engine. First two were done by Jeff Thornburg at Air Force, and then one while he was at SpaceX, and then the third one ever is Stoke. Okay, so this is hyper efficiency, pushing the edges of physics as far as like the ability to put mass into orbit. So like they're doing that, which was already hard. The reusable heat shield and all of the unique kind of stuff there is very difficult.
Regeneratively cooled heat shield is an interesting one, because it's different to anything else that anyone has done.
Yes. So like they're forecasting. So do you believe someone that's been executing, like, based on when they started, even faster than SpaceX? Do you believe someone that they're going to be able to get the $200 per kilogram at the size of a rocket that they're targeting, which is like 3,000 to 5,000 kilograms?
Yeah.
If they can do that, it really changes the economics at the small, focused, kind of dedicated launch window. Or like you talk about like transporter missions, they could basically do 10 mini missions for, instead of one transporter SpaceX Falcon 9 mission, right? So all of a sudden, like, there's opportunity for them. This assumes that they can get to that number that they're talking about. And will it be 5 years? Will it be less than that or more than that? I don't know. But like, I think that is an important thing here, where this is like, you'd want to see Rocket Lab move to that level of capability, hyper reusable, super turnaround, for them to be competing in that small launch market. But there are, like 70 to 100 vehicles, satellites that are on a transport mission on average, right? There's definitely, if you can get the unit economics correct, there is a market there, right? Because they can do, I think our estimates are somewhere like 12 to 20 transporter missions a year. And then if you could do like, 3, 4, 5 times that, because you've got a smaller payload, but you can do it at the same rate or cheaper, then all of a sudden there's a decent market there. Is it a $200 billion Starlink? No, but it's it's a pretty sizable market, and something that I think creates a lot of competition. So sorry, I just wanted to like create that little caveat on there, because most people don't really think about it that way. They just kind of like lump things together. Glad you wanted to talk about AST.
I want to briefly touch on AST, because I think it's a similar situation, in that direct to cell internet there's some unknown there, and it's a bit of a niche. Why is it a niche? Because fundamentally there are certain physics limits to satellites, in that they will never be able to provide the connection speed that you get in a city from 5G towers. That's never going to happen, ever, because satellites are so far away, and you would need an extraordinarily large antenna up in space, something that physically would not even be able to support itself, to provide direct to cell 5G speeds in an urban area where there's hundreds of thousands of people. The physics just doesn't line up, and so direct to cell is still a very attractive market, but it's not ever going to replace urban 5G or 6G, because it's obviously also going to improve. So what is direct to cell good for? Direct to cell is going to be great for coverage gaps. It's going to be great for offloading connectivity in rural areas, or being connected anywhere. And I think it'll be a really good business model, because you'll be able to wholesale and price it into bundles for everyone. So I think eventually, maybe by 2030, in the same way that 5G was an option you could have a couple of years ago, and now it's standard. Every phone contract you have has 5G. I think it'll be very much the same, that you'll have direct to cell connectivity via satellite to your phone, where whenever you leave the city, whenever you're on a highway and the signal drops, whenever you're on an island or a boat, or maybe you go to Antarctica, then you'll always have some signal, right? And I think everyone will pay indirectly a small bit to have that optionality, even though they don't use it all the time. So it can still make a lot of money without replacing terrestrial internet. That being said, I still think you could classify it as a niche market, because it, compared to the 5G market as a whole, compared to telecoms as a whole, it's a small market. What's interesting about AST, though, is that they're very much a pure play direct to cell company. That's all they're focusing on. So they're not trying to do many business lines, and this business line that they are focusing on, direct to cell, Starlink isn't prioritizing it. So although Starlink are doing direct to cell, and they were the first ones up with T-Mobile to get a service going, all of their satellites are broadband. And the ones that are equipped with direct to cell antennas, that's a supplementary antenna. They don't have any pure direct to cell satellites up there. And the ones that are equipped with direct to cell, there's less than 10% of them up there. So even just looking at the data now and the constellation now, you can see that they're not strategically prioritizing it. And I think that leaves a gap for someone else to come in and capture a large share, which is valued on how big that addressable market is. So we're currently doing work now to try and model how big is that direct to cell market, because it's not that easy to model compared to broadband, for example, because it's these use cases that are very transient. Like, when I'm going through a highway, or when I hit a coverage gap, it's not something that I always need, but something I sometimes need. And modeling that is quite difficult. So I think, although AST is it's risky, I think the pure strategy to try and attack a niche that Starlink clearly isn't at the top of their docket, I think is a good strategy.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we're out of time here, guys, but thank you so much for talking to me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I will be keeping an eye on your website for your future research that you share with us all. So,
thank you for having us, Dave. It was fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, Dave. Appreciate it.
All right. See you guys next time. Thanks a lot.